The battlefield was never silent, not even in death. Long after the last las bolt seared through the smoke, after the Vox grill chatter dissolved into static, after the heavy tread of armored boots retreated into the distance, the air still trembled with echoes of violence. Ash drifted like slow snow, glowing embers crumbled from shattered manufactorum walls, and the sky above bled with a bruise-colored dusk. Amid this ruin lay the broken form of a single guardsman, his flak armor scorched, his lasgun split in two, his body little more than a husk. And yet, though his chest no longer rose, though the world's sounds had faded to a dull, muted hum, something within him stirred. He did not know when his last heartbeat came. Perhaps it was on the instant a jagged shard of shrapnel tore through his ribs. Perhaps it was later, as the weight of the collapsed hab wall pinned him to the dirt. Perhaps it was only now, as he noticed, for the first time, that he no longer breathed. Whatever the moment, he had crossed it, and there was no returning. Death had found him, yet its touch was not as he had been taught. For in the catechisms of the Astra Militarum, death was to be followed by light, by the Emperor's mercy, by the warmth of the Astronomicon's glow. Instead, all he found was sound. The song did not carry him the way a river carries a leaf. It threaded him like a needle through cloth, passing him again and again through a fabric he could not name until the weave itself began to feel like home. Memory snagged on its barbs. He saw a hab-block scarewell washed in the sour reek of recalf and oil where he once cleaned a rusted bayonet, the glow of a data slate spelling out orders he pretended to understand, the shadowed nave where an ecclesiarchy preacher pressed an imperial aquila to his brow and promised the emperor's gaze was a shield no heresy could pierce. Each recollection flared with warmth and then bent, warped, and sweetened, as if hands he could not see kneaded them into softer shapes, rounding every hard edge until even fear tasted like sugared fruit. He felt shame at that softening, and then felt the shame itself turn honeyed. A sweetness poured over his resolve, slick and perfumed. There were colors without names, and flavors without tongues to taste them. The sound that had begun as a single note unfolded like an unfurling banner, revealing harmonics that coiled around his thoughts, a cadence of breath, a distant drumbeat like 1,000 heartbeats disciplined into one. The cadence pressed on him until he learned to breathe in time to it, though he had no lungs. And as he learned, a reward bloomed, something like approval, something like a palm against the cheek, something like silk sliding over the idea of skin. The promise in that touch was not safety. It was participation. He would not be saved, but he would be seen. Wherever he was not dark. Darkness implies absence. This place was crowded. Scents rose like banners over unseen armies, promethium and incense, salt and copper, crushed flowers and cold iron. The air rang as though vast chimes sounded from far towers, each toll thick with undertones of laughter and sobbing. He understood then that songs could have architecture, corridors of melody and galleries of hush, and he had been brought into a palace built of sound. The floor was a pulse, the walls were made of ache, the roof was a hush that trembled with withheld delight. He reached for prayer again, not because he believed he could claw his way back, but because the discipline itself steadied him. He tried to recall the litany for the departing soul, the exact cadence the regimental confessor had drilled through cracked lips and a battered Vox amplifier. The first line came, a single shard of gold lodged in his mind. The second line faltered as a tender pressure slipped into the space between words, turning syllables to smoke. When he forced the third line, a choir answered, and his prayer did not break so much as blossom into a new shape, the way a blade glows as it takes heat. Reverence and rebellion wrestled in him, and the heat of their struggle tasted sweet. The sweetness frightened him. The fear pleased the air.
If he had still possessed eyes, he might have turned them to search for companions in his unmaking, and perhaps he did, because the song accommodated him with a view. Shapes approached through the music, each more suggestion than form. One wore the memory of a face he had loved without admitting it, features arranged with the merciless symmetry of a raptor's skull. Another approached like the thought of a wound that never closes, smiling with a mouth that was not a mouth. Their presence eased him and alarmed him in the same instant, as if the same hand both bound and enticed. He understood without logic that these were not comrades, they were hosts. They spoke, or perhaps the palace itself spoke, and used them as tongues. The words arrived as textures. You have been brave, you have been loyal, you have starved and obeyed, you have swallowed orders like glass, you have waited for permission to grieve. Why not rest? Why not be rewarded? The rhetoric was not argument, it was invitation upholstered in velvet. In the part of himself that still belonged to the drilling yards and the barracks hymn, he barked a denial. The denial rang clean for a heartbeat, and the palace loved it. The walls purred. Resistance, too, was a flavor to be savored. He needed an anchor and found one by accident, a memory of the manufactorum's heat, the throb of engines, servitors shuffling past with tubes embedded in waxy flesh, their eyes like stones. He remembered a Scutarius contingent marching through the smoke, helms as impassive as statues, their discipline like a knife that never dulled. The recollection steadied him, not because it was pure, but because it was exact. A fact is a spine. He repeated it to himself. The Scutari marched in sixes, the servitors' chains dragged, the air tasted of solder and spice. Careful naming of real things narrowed the palace's pleasures to outlines he could grip. The palace forgave him this, the way a cat forgives a mouse its scamper, because the chase is charming. He had wondered once, in a moment of barracks gossip and illicit laughter, whether there was any sensation finer than the first mouthful of hot stew after a week of field rations, any sight more lifting than the banner of his regiment snapping clean in a cold wind. In answer, the palace offered him a mouth and filled it with grace. It tasted like relief multiplied, like thirst sated not by water but by meaning. He nearly said yes without language. He nearly gave himself away as a reflex. Somewhere a warning klaxon in his old life, dull, red, and honest, tried to sound. The palace hushed it with a kiss. It was not a cruel hush. Kindness can be so much more fatal than force. In that moment of near surrender, something else intruded. A flicker, not the gold star he had sought, but another kind of light, thin as wire. It was the look on a comrade's face the day they swore on a dented Aquila to hold the line until evac. It was the crackle of a field vox carrying a commissar's clipped command, and the steadying weight of compliance. It was the small dignity of polishing Alaskan's battered stock, because the thing still served. Duty arrived not with grandeur, but with stubbornness. The palace felt his attention tilt, and the temperature of the air changed. Pleasure cooled to patience. The hosts drew nearer, not displeased, only curious, as if the game had become more interesting. "Little soldier," said a voice at last, and this time there were words, gentle as silk drawn over a blade's edge. The syllables were unmistakable. They did not hurt to hear. That was their danger. "You have been promised a great many endings. Allow me to offer beginnings." He would have asked who spoke, but the question would have been a concession. Instead, he asked nothing and braced himself within the exactness of memory, the color of the dust on terror-bound recruitment posters he would never see, the grit in his teeth on parade day, the name of the cook who had smuggled him a second bowl once in a winter that hurt the bones. Oh, the palace loved names. It took each one and rolled it on its tongue, returning it sweeter than he had offered, like fruit laced with something sleep-making. Memory should have been defense. Here it was bait.
A seam in the palace opened. He understood it as a door, because the mind hates thresholds unlabeled. It was not necessary that he step through. Movement in this place was consent, and consent was the only currency that mattered. He clung to the thought like a cliff lip. If he stayed, the palace would sing him into silk. If he refused, the palace would sing him into silk more slowly. He did not know which fate was worse, and indecision itself felt beautiful here. The voice waited, patient as indulgence. "Come," it said, and the floor's pulse aligned perfectly to the memory of his own lost heart. He stood, though no body obeyed him, on the lip of that threshold. The seam yawned wide, and the palace of sound unfolded its promise with terrible patience. He felt the invitation press against him like heat before flame, urging him to step, to dissolve, to be more than he had been. Every instinct screamed that to cross was to lose himself forever, and yet the air behind him carried nothing but emptiness. The battlefield was gone. The comrades who once cried his name were gone. Even the faint star of the Astronomicon had vanished. Only the seam remained, open as a mouth. He tried again to summon memory as shield. He thought of the regiment's banner tattered in rain, of the commissar's hard words, of the emperor's name chiseled into stone upon a shrine half buried in dust. He clung to those things, repeating them in order, like beads on a rosary. For a moment they glowed, fragile sparks trembling in the tide, but the palace heard, and the palace answered. Each name returned changed, each image dressed in silks, every stern syllable wrapped in laughter. What he meant as anchor became ornament, the prayer gilded until it glittered with temptation. Even defiance had been claimed. The voice grew softer now, though closer, as if it spoke directly against what might once have been his ear. No more hunger, no more fear. Every pain you have known, every duty that broke you, every oath that cost you, all of it can be music. Do not resist. To resist is still to serve, and I have room for service. The words glided into him, not as command, but as release. His essence wavered. He could feel the pull of that seam drawing threads from him, memories detaching one by one like feathers plucked from a wing. His first victory, his first failure, the name of a friend long dead. Each drifted from him, vanishing into the vastness beyond. He knew that to follow was to join them, to be woven into the chorus where individuality was mockery, where the only truth was the song. And still he hesitated, for hesitation was all he had left. He was balanced between ruin and surrender, the seam shimmering like a horizon at dawn. The palace waited, unhurried, as though eternity itself bent around his indecision. He wanted to scream, to cry out for the emperor one last time, to demand why his prayers had not reached Terra. But his scream, when it came, was not his own. It was harmony. It was melody. It was beautiful. And he understood with horror that beauty itself had betrayed him. The seam widened, not with force but with welcome. As if the void itself leaned forward to receive him, he drifted, helpless as smoke in a draught, and the palace became more than sound. Shapes bloomed where there should have been none, columns of flesh braided with light, arches woven from sighs, walls alive with 1,000 lips whispering 1,000 names. Their murmurs were not hostile, they caressed, coaxed, reassured, as if to remind him that he was not entering a prison, but a feast where he was both guest and offering. The realization struck harder than any blade. He was desired.
Desire is not hunger alone, but focus. He felt it, sharp and unrelenting, as though the very architecture gazed at him. The sensation was unbearable in its intimacy. Never in life had he been looked upon so completely, not by comrades, not by officers, not even in secret moments of tenderness. Here, every fracture of him, every flaw, every hidden longing was illuminated, dissected, admired. He wanted to turn away, to cover himself, but the gaze only deepened, stripping away even the thought of modesty until shame itself became another thread in the melody. He felt hands, though there were none. They rose from the pulse of the floor, pressing against him with gentle insistence, guiding him toward the seam. They did not push, they invited. The touch was not cold, it was warmth, like resting against a lover's chest, like pressing palms before a sacred flame, like the memory of being held as a child before all innocence had fled. How could he resist such touch? Resistance seemed almost cruel, almost selfish, as though denying kindness itself. And then the whisper sharpened. Their unity broke into strands, each one speaking in a different tongue, though all carried the same intent. One whispered of battles fought, of victories he deserved to claim without dying nameless in the mud. Another spoke of secret hungers, things he had never dared admit, glimpses of flesh beneath armor, the scent of sweat in the barracks, the pull of forbidden laughter. Another, softer still, reminded him of every moment he had swallowed grief, each tear stifled for the sake of discipline. Each whisper promised release, not duty, not struggle, not endurance, only release. His soul buckled. He remembered the catechism, "The Emperor protects." The words echoed like a fortress wall, battered but not yet broken. For one last instant he flung them outward, a defiant shield, and the palace rejoiced. The laughter that answered him was not cruel mockery, but delighted applause, as though his defiance had been expected, rehearsed, even necessary. The seam flared wide, light spilling from it not in gold but in colors no mortal eye was meant to see. The whispers hushed, the hands withdrew, the voice returned, silk on steel. "Now you are ready." With that, the seam did not wait for his step. It swallowed him. He plunged into it, falling without descent, rising without ascent, and the battlefield of his life was sealed behind him like a door that had never existed. What awaited him was no darkness, but the feast of echoes. He fell without falling, moved without motion, until he came to rest in a space that was not space at all. Here sound had weight, color had taste, and touch had no boundary. The first thing he knew was himself, but not as he had been. His soul was stretched thin and fine, every thread vibrating in sympathy with an unseen orchestra. It was not pain, nor was it comfort. It was a new state of being, where sensation became the air he breathed, and thought itself trembled like a string plucked too tightly. Around him rose towers of light that pulsed with rhythm, beating like colossal hearts. They were not stone nor crystal, but frozen screams refracted into brilliance, each beam trembling with voices begging to be heard. He strained to listen, and when he did, he realized that every cry was familiar. They were his own, echoes of himself twisted and returned. His first gasp as shrapnel tore his flesh, his whispered prayers in the trench line, the groan of hunger after days without rations, the laugh he once choked back for fear of the commissar's rebuke. All of them played back, layered, amplified, stretched into music. His very life had been seized and scored like a composition, and now it played around him in endless reprise.
He tried to close his ears, but he had none. He tried to close his mind, but the echoes penetrated deeper. Each sound that reached him was more than memory. It was sensation reborn, but heightened, sharpened, carved into the bone of his soul. The hunger he had once felt returned, but this time it was endless, gnawing, ravenous, a hole he could never fill. The laughter he had swallowed returned as well, but it was forced out of him in waves, each note edged with hysteria until it rang like glass about to shatter. Pleasure and pain became indistinguishable. One moment he thought he was drowning in sweetness, the next he was gagging on rot, only to realize both were the same flavor, turned inside out. Others were there, though he could not see them clearly. Their forms flickered like mirages, outlines of souls straining and collapsing, writhing and embracing. One sang in a voice so achingly beautiful he thought it might anchor him, but the longer he listened, the more it frayed his resolve, for beneath every note was terror. Another reached out with arms too long, their touch warm at first, then burning, then freezing, then blissful, then gone, until he longed for its return even as he recoiled. Each presence was both tormentor and companion, partner and predator. He understood then that Slaanesh's realm was not built upon annihilation, but upon the cruelest gift of all, to give what one craved, and in giving, destroy. The banquet unfolded. It was not food upon a table, but sensation pressed into his being. A sweetness dripped into him, filling him with warmth, and he thought for a moment of stew on a winter's night. But the warmth grew hotter, too hot, until it seared like molten iron. Then it cooled, leaving him empty, hungrier than before. Each bite of pleasure only carved his hunger deeper, each mouthful of delight hollowing him further. It was not nourishment, it was famine disguised as feast. He tried to call out, though to whom he did not know. Perhaps to the emperor, perhaps to himself. But the moment he gave sound to thought, the feast claimed it. His cry became chorus, echoed back 1,000-fold, each repetition altered until his plea for mercy was returned as a hymn of longing, his despair remade into laughter, his denial transformed into sighs of surrender. Every word he formed was stolen and savored, played back to him as if mocking the very act of resistance. He wanted to stop, to fall silent, to guard himself in stillness. But silence was impossible here. Even the act of withholding, of refusing, became part of the music. The feast devoured not only what was given, but what was withheld. His restraint became another dish upon the table, consumed and reflected, echoed until he could no longer tell whether the words in his mind belonged to him or to the realm itself. And through it all, he sensed presence, not in form, not in face, but in the way every sound leaned toward him, every flavor curved around him, every echo caressed him like a hand on the back of his neck. The Dark Prince did not show itself, not yet, but the soul knew he was heard, he was tasted, he was savored. He wondered with a horror too vast to contain, if this was eternity, not to be ended, not to be annihilated, but to be consumed again and again, every echo torn and replayed, every desire teased and twisted, every memory wrung for sensation until even despair became a delicacy. The feast of echoes had only begun.
He learned that the echoes could be guided, but only by risking more of himself. When he focused on a single memory until it hurt, the towers of light adjusted, their pulses shifting to match the rhythm he offered. For a handful of breaths that were not breaths, the chorus dulled to a tolerable murmur, and in that hush, he tried to fix his thoughts on a scene with edges that could not be remade. A firing line at dawn, boots aligned, lasguns shouldered, the breath of the platoon frosting the air in one sharp exhalation. Precision, not pleasure. Order, not appetite. The image held like a bolt hammered into fractured stone. Then the feast tasted the discipline itself and discovered a new delicacy. The snap of drill became the crack of a whip draped in velvet. The unity of ranks melted into the warmth of bodies pressed too close. The relief of obedience transformed into the ache of being chosen for favor. He recoiled, and the towers brightened, pleased by the new arrangement, delighted by his recoil most of all.
The presence surrounding him drew nearer, without crossing any measurable distance. It manifested as textures, as moods that swept across him like weather, as the ghost of a laugh brushing the ear he no longer possessed. Once, a pressure like a fingertip pressed gently against what might once have been his sternum, and a page of memory turned with a rustle he could feel. He saw himself hunched in the shadow of a chimera's hull while shells screamed overhead, a comrade beside him tracing the twin-headed eagle on a dented charm. There had been no space then for anything but fear masquerading as bravery, yet here the fear unfurled, revealing scents and shivers he had ignored. The leather bite of the sling against his palm, the salt of sweat, the closeness of another life at his shoulder. The feast rescored the moment, lacing tenderness into it, coaxing desire from where he had never permitted it to bloom. It did not invent his longings, it simply refused to let them remain unsung. He tried an uglier refuge and dragged up a memory that had stained him for years. The day he obeyed an order that felt like betrayal. The day they left wounded behind because the timetable was a god with sharper teeth than compassion. He forced himself to relive the moment without flinching, to count the paces away from the cries, to catalog the weight of guilt as a ration he deserved to carry. The feast drank this too. Guilt proved heady as wine. It warmed him, then chilled him, then wrapped him in an absolution so soft it almost broke him. Voices cooed that guilt meant he cared, that caring was a sweetness, that sweetness was proof he belonged at the table. He saw how easily remorse could be polished into self-love, and how swiftly both could be set down as courses between crystal laughter and silver sighs. If this was a prison, it was one made from the inmate's own furniture. He felt the bars and realized they were fashioned from the very virtues he had relied upon to keep himself upright: endurance, loyalty, restraint. Each, once lifted into this palace, became a string to be plucked, a spice to be ground, a ribbon to bind his wrists more pleasingly. He sought ugliness then, a thing the realm might reject, and flung it outward. The memory of him stealing a crust of bread from a wounded man's tray, telling himself he would return it, and never doing so. The echo came back gilded, the theft rewritten as hunger's honesty, the honesty praised as a courage to name desire. The compliment slid into him like an unearned medal pinned to a rotten heart. He wanted to tear it off. He had nothing left to tear with. In the shifting crowd of souls, one presence steadied into clearer outline. It moved with a grace that mocked gravity, a long, slow bow of head and shoulder, as if the act of acknowledgement were the rarest gift in existence. No armor covered it, no regimental cloth, nothing that could be named with the vocabulary of the Astra Militarum, and yet it was dressed in a tension so complete that it felt like raiment. He understood that here to be noticed was a robe, to be chosen an anointing, to be singled out a coronation. The presence offered him no threat and no mercy, only regard. He was seen down to the crack in the bone of him. Cold crept in with the warmth, a paradox that made him shiver in a body he did not wear. He remembered a rumor passed over a low flame in a forward dugout, the kind soldiers speak to one another as charms against thinking too hard, that the Dark Prince possessed no need to lie, only to interpret. He found the rumor waiting here like a chair already drawn out for him. He sat in it without meaning to.
"Tell me," the presence asked, and the words arrived as a fingertip drawing a circle where his throat would have been. "What do you want?" It sounded like a chaplain's question scrubbed free of judgment. He knew clever answers would be eaten and served back steaming. He knew silence was a statement composed in amber, to be displayed and admired until it cracked. He looked instead for the one want that might anchor rather than erase him. The list tried to grow, a hedge of excuses and pieties, but the realm clipped it down to the root with patient shears. What remained was small, homely, almost foolish. He wanted not to be alone. The feast brightened, Candles he could not see flared. A warmth like breath against a pulse point found him again, precisely where no pulse beat. Aloneness, the presence murmured, and it pronounced the word as if tasting an unfamiliar fruit. So modest, so immense. Stay with us, and you will never be alone. 100 hands shaped from choir notes reached, touching nothing and everything. Companionship poured over him in waves, company without friction, fraternity without requirement, intimacy without cost. The counterfeit was flawless because it was distilled from the genuine. He felt himself leaning, like an exhausted man, toward sleep he had not earned. The realm did not yank, it cradled. Into that cradle he smuggled a splinter. Companionship recalled a name, and the name conjured a face. Talon, who had once shoved him behind a blast wall and taken a shard that should have been his. Talon, who had cursed the commissar in a whisper and then sung low to keep the squad steady on a night patrol through ash that rose to their knees. Talon's laugh had never been easy. It cost him something each time. The cost made it precious. The presence tasted the name and hummed with appreciation, but when it returned Talon to him, the roughness was gone. The laugh was sleek, the sacrifice effortless, the friendship pleasing in all the parts where it had once chafed. The perfection was a violence. He clutched the memory as one might clutch a knife by the blade, letting it cut to keep it real. "Why bleed?" the presence asked, and there was no malice in it, only wonder threaded with delight. "We will smooth every edge. We will make of you an instrument that never plays a wrong note." He thought of manufactoria, where servitors sanded imperfections from casings until each component met tolerance. He imagined himself on a conveyor he could no longer step off. He did not want to be perfect. He wanted to be particular. The admission startled him with its honesty. It startled the feast as well. The tower's rhythm paused by a fraction, a syncopation like a heartbeat skipping and righting itself. Surprise here was not anger's sister, it was curiosity's lover. The pause gave him a pocket of air in a place that had none. He filled it with a prayer he had never risked aloud, one that made no promises and asked for no miracles. It was simply a naming of who he had been and who he hoped not to lose. A guardsman who had run when he should have held, and held when he wanted to run. Who had stolen bread and later given his rations to a recruit shaking from the cold, who had believed and doubted by turns and tried to carry both without lying about either. He offered this not to be forgiven, but to be counted. The prayer tasted of dust and honest work. It was not beautiful. The realm, which loved beauty as a craft and a cudgel, weighed the ugliness like a jeweler testing a flawed gem, and for the first time the echo came back with less sugar on its rim. The presence inclined, interests sharpening. "Particular," it repeated, as if sampling a spice not often used in this kitchen. The word did not wither. It did not glow either. It hung between them, stubborn as a chipped cup placed among crystal flutes. He sensed beneath the velvet of the feast a ripple of anticipation, as if more doors were being prepared, as if new rooms of sensation had been scented and lit in honor of this small resistance. The realm was patient. The realm was infinite. It could afford to make his particularity a course of its own. And so the feast turned the page again, and the towers leaned inward, and the next dish arrived clothed in memory he had not thought to taste. He saw the day he first fired a lasgun and missed, the shame, the heat in his ears, the wink of the instructor who had quietly adjusted his grip. The memory held like an ember in a palm. The realm lifted it in tongs and brought it to his mouth. He could not tell whether it would warm him into shape or burn him through entirely. The ember memory burned his palms until he thought he would drop it, but there was nowhere to set it down. The feast leaned in with all its unseen mouths and waited. He tasted the crackle ozone, the tang of iron, the sweat of training days so long past he had stopped naming them. The miss of his first shot, the instructor's correction. These were his, unadorned, fragile, and unfit for feasting, and that was why he clung to them. The towers of light quivered, impatient, as if they too expected this flawed morsel to be refined into sweetness. But when the realm tried to spin it into silk, something resisted. The moment stayed crooked, awkward, stubbornly human, a crooked note among perfect chords. He braced himself, waiting for the lash of correction, the flood of pleasure-pain to break his grip, but the punishment never came. Instead, a hush rippled through the air, vast and unsettling. The feast had found something it could not easily consume. And in that hush, the presence returned, closer than before. Its voice slid into him like a breath-warming frost, intimate enough to bruise. "You carry a shard," it said, not with anger, but with fascination. "It cuts you even now. Why keep a weapon that wounds its master?" He wanted to answer, but words were treacherous here. Every syllable birthed echoes that twisted meaning. Still he forced the thought into shape. "Because it is mine." He did not dress it in loyalty or faith or glory. Just possession, plain and unadorned. Mine. The word struck the feast strangely. The towers flickered, their rhythm faltering, other souls twisted in confusion, their moans and laughter pausing mid-breath. For an instant, the great orchestra of sensations stumbled over a single, defiant note. Then the laughter returned, softer, richer, as though indulgence itself had been amused. "Mine," the presence repeated, savoring the sound. "Then let it be yours. But know that even what is yours can be sung." The world convulsed, and the crooked ember became a stage. He stood, or believed he stood, on stone that pulsed with sound, beneath skies woven of shifting silks. Before him stretched a hall of mirrors, each reflecting him not as he was, but as he might be. In one he was draped in jewels, adored by 1,000 voices. In another, he was a beast, clawed and chained, roaring as crowds drank his agony like wine. In another, he was dust, scattered across a garden that sang with flowers made of screaming faces. Every reflection was truth twisted, promise sharpened into blade. He reached for the crooked ember again, but found only echoes. The mirrors leaned closer, their surfaces rippling like hungry mouths. The Feast of Echoes was not only music now, it was theater, carnival, and he was both performer and performance. The mirrors swelled until they filled his vision, each reflection pressing forward with insistent hunger. He saw himself laughing on a throne of bones, lips purple with spilled wine. He saw himself writhing as a chained beast. His every spasm met with applause that rang like thunder. He saw himself dissolving into motes of light, each speck swallowed by flowers whose petals dripped with pleasure and grief in equal measure. Every version of him begged to be chosen, and each choice promised both coronation and damnation. The presence whispered, though now the voice was layered, as if 100 mouths spoke through the same lips. "Every soul is a mask, little soldier. Some you wore in life, some you denied. All are yours. Choose one, and you will be perfected." The temptation did not arrive as command, nor even as entreaty. It came as inevitability, like breath after silence, like thirst after ash. He tried to resist. He turned from one mirror to the next, searching for his true face. But each reflection was seductive, not because it was foreign, but because it contained seeds of recognition. He remembered the lust that stirred in him once when he caught a glimpse of flesh in a barracks corridor. There it was in the jeweled lordling, draped in lover's adoration. He remembered the fury when comrades fell to needless orders. There it was in the chained beast, roaring with righteous pain.
He remembered his wish, whispered once in youth, to vanish and be forgotten. There it was in the scattering motes, free at last from all burdens. Nothing here was false. That was the cruelty. The crooked ember burned in his palm, faint but steady. He clung to it, knowing it was imperfection that made it his. Yet the feast pressed closer, crowding him with its perfumes and songs, urging him to let go. "Choose," the voices sang, and the word rolled like thunder across 1,000 tongues. "Choose and be made whole." His grip faltered. For a heartbeat that was not a heartbeat, he wanted to surrender, to step into one of the mirrors and let it embrace him. To be adored or to be feared or to be nothing at all. Was it not better than standing bare, crooked, and incomplete? But even as the thought bloomed, he felt the hook in it. To choose was to be chosen. To surrender was to be played. And though he feared the cut of the ember, he feared more the loss of his last fragment of self. He spoke then, voice ragged, echo twisting into chorus. "I will not choose." The mirrors quivered, their surfaces rippling as if struck. The laughter that followed was immense, rolling like a tide that shook the palace of echoes to its roots. It was not mockery, but jubilation, as though his refusal was a flavor long awaited. The presence leaned close once more, its breath heavy with sweetness that sickened. "Then you will wear them all." And with those words the mirror shattered, and the carnival of masks began. Shards rained down, but none struck him. They melted into light before they touched whatever skin he still believed he possessed, seeping into him like heat through stone. The air trembled, charged with expectation. And then the masks appeared. They did not fall from above or rise from below. They bloomed around him like petals from an unseen flower, each one bearing a face he half recognized, each one singing with the echo of a life he might have lived. The first mask hovered before him, pale and gleaming, its lips curled in an eternal smile. He felt the pull of triumph in it, the adoration of legions, the intoxicating weight of being beloved beyond all measure. His chest swelled as if already filled with the applause of crowds. Then another drifted near, carved of iron and shadow, its mouth open in a roar of pain. In it he felt the fury of a martyr chained to spectacle, agony made holy by the audience's delight. Others followed, a hollow mask of dust and bone, whispering the quiet bliss of surrender, a golden mask with eyes weeping jewels, every tear a promise of endless pleasure, a mask of glass cracked and fragile, reflecting only his own crooked ember of memory back at him.
They circled him, closer and closer, until his vision was nothing but faces, until the song of their voices became a whirlwind of seduction. Each mask pressed forward, grazing his soul, leaving traces of sensation behind. A kiss on the nape of the neck, a lash across the spine, a sigh against the lips, a hand clutching his heart. He staggered, though he had no body, reeling beneath the weight of too many selves. The presence laughed softly, indulgent, amused. You sought to deny choice. Very well, you will become choice itself. At the words, the masks pressed inward, fusing to him. One clamped to his face, filling his mouth with sweetness so sharp it burned. Another fixed to the back of his head, whispering agony in every thought. Others layered over his chest, his hands, his very bones, until he was a patchwork of reflections, stitched together from contradictions. He was ruler and slave, beast and angel, ash and flame.
Every step he might have taken in life was now bound to him, forced to sing. The chorus swelled, deafening, triumphant. The feast had found its melody. He was no longer one man's soul. He was a carnival, a walking mask, and endless parade of hungers. Every laugh he had swallowed, every sob he had silenced, every desire he had denied now wore its own face, and each face demanded to be heard. He tried to cry out again, to summon the crooked ember, but his voice fractured into 100 echoes, each shouting something different: pleasure, pain, laughter, despair, until he could no longer tell which was his own. The ember flared once in protest, flickering weakly through the glass mask, still reflecting it. But even that mask began to crack, its surface glowing as the feast leaned closer, intent on consuming even that last imperfection. And as the carnival whirled around him, the presence whispered one final truth, so soft it slid past every defense. This is eternity, little soldier. Not silence, not light, not rest. Only performance. Forever. The masks began to move of their own accord. At first they shifted gently, swaying like pendulums in time to the unseen orchestra. Then they spun, faster and faster, tugging at him as though he were no longer master of his own limbs, no longer pilot of his own soul. Each mask had a rhythm, each rhythm a demand. One pulled him into laughter so sharp it split into screams. Another dragged him downward into sobs that tasted of wine, thick and cloying. A third made him whisper prayers, not to the emperor, but to the nameless faces that watched from beyond, eager for the next act. He realized then that he was not alone in this masquerade. The chamber around him widened, its walls of song drawing back to reveal an audience vast beyond reckoning. Souls lined the horizon, countless as stars, each bound in their own masks, each dancing in grotesque harmony. Some rived in chains that shimmered like jewels, others sprawled across thrones of bone and silk, adored by phantoms that kissed their wounds. Others still hung suspended in the air, played like instruments by invisible hands, their screams tuned into chords that rang through the hall. The crowd was no crowd, for it too was part of the performance. Every soul reflected the other, each dancer's motion feeding the next, each scream harmonizing with another's laugh, each sob answering a sigh. He saw now the cruelest truth of the feast. Individuality was not stripped away, but multiplied, every fragment of self magnified until it could no longer be contained. The soul was not devoured in silence, it was stretched, broken, adorned, and displayed. The presence lingered just behind him, no longer whispering but humming low, a note so deep it made the floor pulse beneath his imagined feet. "Do you hear them?" it asked, and indeed he did. Not only the music, not only the echoes, but the recognition. Each masked soul cried out, and in every cry he heard a reflection of his own. Their hunger was his hunger, their torment his torment, their fleeting sweetness his fleeting sweetness. He was not alone, just as the presence had promised, but this togetherness was a mockery, a communion forged from endless appetite. The crooked ember within him guttered, weak and small. He tried to clutch it tighter, but the masks pressed harder against him, smothering it beneath their radiance. For a moment he thought it lost, drowned beneath the chorus. But just as despair welled in him, the ember flared, not bright, not strong, but stubborn. Its crooked light cut through one of the masks, the glass one, that had always reflected his true self.
The crack widened, spilling a shard of imperfect fire into the masquerade. The audience shuddered, the orchestra stumbled, the presence paused. And in that pause, he felt again the ragged edges of who he had been, a soldier, nameless in the vast ledger of the Imperium, crooked and incomplete, but his own. The carnival stilled for a heartbeat that was not a heartbeat. Then the laughter resumed, richer than ever, rolling like thunder across the hall. The presence leaned close, and its words brushed against him like velvet soaked in blood. Yes, it purred. Keep it, sing it. Even imperfection can be beautiful when played forever. And the carnival spun again, louder, brighter, hungrier than before. The spinning became a storm. His soul was pulled and twisted, every mask tugging him into roles he could not escape. He was monarch, beast, supplicant, phantom, all at once, each face singing through him in an endless chorus. The hall of echoes swelled with sound, and the audience of souls leaned forward, as if feeding on his performance. He realized with horror that the crooked ember within him had not saved him from the feast. It had only given it new material, the ember's defiance, its jagged edges, its refusal to be smoothed away. These too were woven into the music, another flavor for the Dark Prince to savor. The presence coiled around him like smoke, neither near nor far, neither body nor absence. Its voice now carried no words, only laughter, indulgent and soft, yet vast enough to shake him to his core. He understood then that Slaanesh had no need to annihilate him. To annihilate was mercy, far sweeter to stretch him into infinity, to make his hunger unending, to turn every fragment of resistance into a new verse of the eternal song. He looked again at the countless souls across the masquerade, each lost in their own performance. Some wore their masks willingly, dancing with a joy that curdled into madness. Others fought, their defiance glowing like embers, only to be smothered, reignited, and smothered again in endless rhythm. He could not tell if they knew each other, if any true companionship existed here, or if even the semblance of unity was another mask laid upon them. What bound them all was not love, nor hate, nor even despair. It was the music, the endless, ravenous music, and he was part of it now. Every time he resisted, the orchestra swelled. Every time he yielded, the melody deepened. Every choice, every silence, every scream was taken, echoed, and fed back to him, until he could no longer tell where he ended and the feast began.
In a moment of cruel clarity, he saw what awaited him. Not oblivion, not even torment, but eternity as part of a song that never stopped, never resolved, never gave rest. A chorus of contradictions, beautiful and hideous, endless and inescapable. And through it all, the presence hummed, pleased beyond measure. The Feast of Echoes had only been the beginning. The Carnival of Masks was forever. The moment the feast gave way to the carnival, he felt it not as transition, but as revelation. The masks he had borne became flesh, became weight, became chains dressed as ornaments. They clung to him, some cold, some warm, some whispering constantly in voices that belonged to him and yet did not. The hall of mirrors had collapsed into a stage, and upon it he now stood. The crooked ember pulsed faintly in his chest, but here its light was drowned by brilliance. For the carnival was not content with sound alone, it demanded spectacle. He looked down and found his body remade. It was not the form of the guardsman who had fallen beneath rubble and shrapnel. His frame shifted from one moment to the next, swelling into the shape of a lord in gilded armor, before collapsing into the crouched figure of a beast, ribs showing through skin slick with sweat and blood.
Each transformation was marked by the dawning of another mask, each mask an identity imposed upon him, each identity drawn from a secret or a fear or a hunger he had carried in life. The crooked ember tried to hold him steady, but every time it burned too brightly, another mask pressed tighter, muffling it beneath painted smiles and jeweled eyes. Around him, the carnival surged. Souls in their thousands writhed and danced, each trapped in their own mask. Some laughed as they tore themselves apart, delighting in their agony as though the act itself was performance. Others sang hymns in voices made of glass, their throats bleeding beauty, while their eyes wept despair. Some played instruments fashioned from their own bones, flutes of femurs and drums of stretched skin, beating rhythm into eternity. The spectacle was dazzling, intoxicating, unbearable. The presence spoke again, though now it was no longer a whisper in the ear. It was the stage itself, the air, the lights, the very rhythm that forced his limbs to move. Here, it said, you will never end, you will never fade, you will never be alone. Every part of you that you tried to silence will dance, every hunger you tried to deny will sing, every shame you tried to bury will be crowned in gold. This is truth, this is beauty, this is eternity. He wanted to deny it, but the masks betrayed him. When he tried to scream defiance, one mask turned his voice into laughter. When he tried to stand still, another made him bow and twirl. When he tried to clutch the ember, another spread his arms wide as if in welcome to the audience. He was not his own master here. He was instrument, puppet, spectacle. And yet, in the cracks between motions, he felt the ember stubbornly pulse, irregular and imperfect, reminding him of the crooked self he had been. The carnival roared its approval. The audience of souls leaned forward, their masked faces glowing with hunger. Each time he moved, they echoed him until the whole chamber was filled with countless versions of his own performance. He was multiplied, reflected, magnified. His identity was not erased, but shattered into infinite fragments, each one displayed, each one consumed. The horror was not in losing himself, it was in being made endless.
Still, the ember flickered, and each flicker brought a question sharper than any mask. Was it better to let it die and be lost in the spectacle, or to guard it, knowing that its defiance only fed the carnival further? He tried to find stillness in motion, the way a drilled platoon finds discipline inside the chaos of a charge. If he could not halt the dance, perhaps he could choreograph it. He sought the cadence of a parade ground, the square geometry of boots and breath, the comfort of repetition. For a breath that was not a breath, it worked. His limbs obeyed a march step drawn from memory rather than from the stage's will. The rhythm steadied him, and a hush fell over the nearest masks, as though the carnival leaned in to study a new trick. Then the floor sang beneath him, and the beat he'd summoned was braided with something velvet and sly, turning his cadence into a glide, his square into a curve. Precision gave way to flourish. Applause like rainfall greeted the change. He had won nothing, only taught the carnival a new step it could use to bend him prettier. He tested another tactic and reached for ugliness. The mask that grinned with a lord's serene cruelty pulled his mouth toward praise. He wrenched it aside and hauled the beast mask forward instead. Claws that were not claws scraped the stage. His spine arched, a growl tore loose, and for an instant the audience recoiled from the absence of polish. The growl did not harmonize. It scraped. It offended. The ember brightened, faint and crooked, proud of the misfit sound. The presence hummed in appreciation, then parted the air with gentle fingertips and set a choir to echo the growl in fifths and sevenths until it dazzled. Offense learned elegance in a heartbeat. They would never let him be merely ugly. The carnival's cruelty was craft. He remembered a chaplain's speech from a transport hold before a drop, not the words, which had been stock, but the tremor the man thought to hide. The tremor had made the sermon honest. The masks pounced when he pulled that tremor close, gilding it, polishing it, tinting it with perfumes until sincerity glittered like an ornament. The ember stung him then, as if to say, "Do not hand them your truths already polished. Keep them rough." He tried. He tried to hold a memory by the splinters, bleeding his nameless hands on the edges of who he had been. His first night watch alone when fear turned the wind into footsteps. The time he laughed at a joke he should have condemned because it spared a recruit his shame. The moment he aimed a fraction low to give a fleeing silhouette a chance. These were not acts he was proud of. They were not acts he could disown. He presented them jagged, and the carnival brought out velvet-lined tongs. When the tongs reached for him, he flinched and stumbled into another mask, glass and hairline cracked, the one that had reflected the ember from the start. Through it he saw the stage split into tiers. Above, thrones grew like flowers from living backs. Below, pits yawned lined with tongues that lapped at tears. There were attendants gliding between, figures too graceful to be human, their hands ending in the promise of touch more than in fingers. They garlanded the mast with chains that did not chafe, placed diadems that hummed against skulls, tipped cups that never emptied. He knew them as courtiers, though they wore no heraldry but attention, and their attention was a narcotic. Each time they brushed a cheek, or tightened a chain, or adjusted a diadem by a hair, a soul shuddered and sang sweeter. There was devotion in their every gesture, and if devotion could kill, this would be a clean death. But no death came. The courtiers reached him at last, moving like scent. One raised his chin with two fingers that were music more than flesh. Another lifted his wrist and turned it, reading veins as though they were script. A third leaned close, and the silk of its breath wrote promises along his jawline. You will not be forgotten. You will never be ordinary again. Your littleness has been admitted to greatness. He wanted to spit the promises back, but the mask over his mouth translated spit into honey, and the audience sighed. He looked beyond them to the horizon of faces, and found to his horror and relief that not all eyes glittered in bliss. Some stared in a focus so tight it seemed like prayer. One soul in particular held stillness like a candle cupped against a gale. Their masks were fewer, their movements smaller, their ember a stubborn coal. He tried to fix on them, to learn by watching, to let that quiet teach his limbs what the music would not. The courtiers noticed where he looked and applauded his taste. The still soul was lifted on a platform of hands and brought nearer, not to comfort him, but to enrich his view. The lesson arrived with a smile. Even your hope is a spectacle here.
The platform revolved, and the still soul turned with it, showing him profiles carved by restraint. He wanted to ask how they had kept anything at all. He wanted a word, any word, that did not come lacquered. The carnival answered for them. The stillness was curated, allowed, then showcased, then multiplied until it was another dance. The revelation keened through him. In this place, even refusal was a costume. He tested the floor for trapdoors, the air for edges, the music for a scene he could pry. There were none. There was, however, timing. He felt the orchestrated swells, the crescendos that demanded ecstasy, the troughs that offered exhaustion, the rests, short, stingy rests between movements. The rests were real. In them, the courtiers drifted to adjust props, to reset applause, to dab at the blood beauty with cloths that left no stain. During one of those rests, he let his knees buckle. The fall was calculated, but the fatigue was not. He surrendered to plain weariness. No flourish, no lesson, no appetite. It was a simple human collapse, and it shocked the stage as if he had spoken an unknown language. The masks tugged to dramatize the faint. He refused them. He lay there in the pause, like a lump of unsung matter, and waited. A cold slid under the heat, a sensation so clean it stung like water on a burn. The presence bent, interested. The courtiers hesitated, unsure whether to gild or to watch. Under the glass mask, the ember guttered, then took. The flame was as crooked as ever, but for the space of a heartbeat's ghost, it lit without being turned into spectacle. He felt it illuminate a corridor of memory he had not dared open, not triumphs or crimes or pleasures, but the habit of mourning, pulling boots, buckling webbing, checking charge packs, the coin weight of routine. The cadence of living without theater. The carnival leaned so close to listen that its jewels chimed. If there was a seam anywhere, it would live inside that habit. He rested his nameless palm on the ember, not to fan it brighter, but to cool it, to keep it small. Small fires escape notice. Small fires survive. A bell sounded, low, sumptuous, inevitable, and the rest was over. The music lifted its head, expecting him to lift with it, smiling, bleeding, perfect. He rose because he had to, but something in the hinge of the motion did not polish. The courtiers missed it. The audience missed it. The presence did not. Ah, it breathed, neither pleased nor displeased, only attentive, like a maestro hearing a new instrument tune in the pit. You are learning to hide your flame. He did not answer. The next movement would begin, and he would dance because a galaxy of hunger required it. Yet, within the machinery of his steps, a tiny, unbeautiful rhythm ticked. Boot buckles, webbing, checks. He carried it the way a soldier carries a knife in an unapproved sheath. Not to win a battle, not even to cut a path, but to remember what the hand is for. The lights swelled, the applause began, the chorus sharpened to a glittering edge. He lifted his face into a masked smile and felt the small cadence continue inside the teeth of the spectacle, stubborn as a grit of sand in a jeweled gear. The bell faded, its echo folding into silence that was not silence, but anticipation. He stood, the masks shifting on his face and body like restless animals, each one tugging him toward a new performance. The courtiers circled, scent and sound and suggestion, waiting to see how he would move next. The audience of souls leaned forward as one, their jeweled chains clattering like rainfall, their eyes burning with hunger. The stage thrummed beneath his feet, alive, demanding.
The crooked ember in his chest pulsed faintly, the only irregular rhythm in a world built on perfect cadence. It reminded him of mornings in the barracks, the scrape of boots on stone, the taste of stale recalf, the shuffle of men waking to another day of orders. Those moments had been imperfect, ugly even, but they had been his. He clutched them now, letting their crookedness carry him, even as the masks tried to smooth them into spectacle. The presence returned, heavy as velvet, its voice sliding through the air with amusement. "You persist," it murmured, "not in denial, not in surrender, but in defiance made small. Do you not see, little soldier, even this crooked fire is mine. Every beat you guard becomes another note in my symphony. Every imperfection you treasure becomes another jewel in my crown. Nothing escapes the carnival." And yet, in that moment, he realized something. If even his resistance fed the carnival,
then the ember's worth was not in triumph, but in memory. It was not a weapon, not a shield, not a path to escape. It was a reminder, a tethered to who he had been before the masks, before the feast, before death. He could not win against the carnival, but he could remember. And to remember was to remain, however faintly, himself. The presence laughed, indulgent, indulgence vast as the void. "Then remember," it said, "and let eternity remember with you." The music swelled, the masks pressed tighter, and the carnival of masks roared into motion once more. The carnival surged like a tide, its rhythms no longer waiting for him to falter. They demanded, commanded, consumed. His limbs moved without his bidding, each gesture amplified into grotesque beauty. One mask pulled him into the shape of a lord, arms raised to receive adoration. Another forced him into a beast's crouch, snarling and clawing as the audience screamed in ecstasy. Another stretched his face into a grin so wide it ached, though he had no flesh left to ache with. He was fractured across a dozen roles at once, each one demanding total surrender. The courtiers glided closer, weaving chains of sound and scent, laying them across his shoulders like cloaks of honor. Every link tightened, but none cut. They did not imprison him, they dressed him. Chains here were garments, and the weight of them made the crowd cheer louder, as though his burden was their delight. One draped a crown upon his head, its thorns pressing sweetly into his skull, and the chorus erupted into song. He was spectacle, he was feast, he was theirs. The ember flickered wildly under the masks, nearly extinguished beneath the flood. But in its stubborn glow he found again the crookedness of his life, the slip of a bayonet in his hands, the off note of a hymn sung after a long march, the rough laughter of comrades who knew fear too well to hide it. Those crooked truths did not shine, did not glitter, did not seduce. They scraped, and scraping, they cut. For an instant the masks recoiled, the stage stuttered, the audience faltered in their song. He gasped at the silence, brief and sharp like breath drawn between storms. In that pause he realized something terrible. The carnival could not end him. It did not want to. It only wanted him to dance forever. His resistance would not free him, but neither would his surrender. Eternity here was not measured in victory or defeat, but in performance without end. And as that knowledge burned through him, the presence whispered from everywhere at once, soft and certain. "Now you see, to be mine is not to die, but to endure."
The ember flared once more in answer, crooked and bright, as the carnival of masks swallowed him again. The stage unfurled like a living tapestry, and for a heartbeat that felt like an hourglass turned sideways, the masks on his body seemed to loosen. He was still surrounded by the endless masquerade, courtiers gliding on music instead of air, souls twirling and convulsing in their jeweled chains, the audience roaring its hunger. But within the storm, a strange clarity spread. He could see every thread of himself at once, every face the carnival had forced on him, every echo it had stolen, every desire it had rescored into spectacle. It was all there, naked and glaring, like a ledger opened in firelight. The crooked ember pulsed against his ribs, irregular as a heartbeat on the brink of stopping. It didn't flare to burn away his chains or to strike at the presence. It simply glowed, stubborn and unshaped. He realized then what it truly was. It was not a weapon to kill the carnival. It was not a path back to Terra. It was only the memory of being small and human, the warmth of another shoulder in a trench, the taste of bad rations, the weight of a lasgun in numb hands, the ache of a night spent awake because orders demanded it. All the things too homely to be made beautiful, too crooked to be refined. He did not hide it this time. He let the ember's crookedness show through the masks, let it seep between the seams. The light wasn't bright, but it was raw. The crowd's roar faltered,
The courtiers stilled. Even the presence tilted, intrigued. For a fraction of eternity, no one applauded, no one sang. The masks whispered among themselves, but could not agree on a new role to give him. It was not victory, it was not freedom, but it was a pause. His pause, in the endless performance. He inhaled a breath he did not have, and held it. In that breath, he remembered his name. It trembled on his tongue, jagged and plain, stripped of rank and pretense. The carnival did not echo it back. It had no arrangement for that sound. The presence at last spoke, its voice low and curious, like a maestro hearing a new instrument out of tune. "Little soldier, this will take longer than I thought." And then the lights swelled, the music swelled, and the masks closed in again. But the ember stayed. Crooked, faint, defiant. He began to move once more, not because he was commanded, but because eternity demanded motion. The carnival of masks roared its approval, and somewhere, beneath all the noise, his ember whispered back. This was not escape, it was not salvation, but it was something. And as the movement swept him onward, the edges of the masquerade shifted, hinting at something vaster, something stranger, waiting beyond this hall of performance. A realm where rumor and liturgy merged, where even the Dark Prince's court dissolved into speculation and prayer. The carnival of masks faded behind him like a curtain closing. What waited ahead was the eternal stage.
The curtain did not fall. It dissolved, as if the silks of the masquerade had melted into mist. He was carried forward, not by his own will, but by the momentum of eternity itself, a tide that refused to ebb. The masks clung still, but looser now, their whispers dimming into murmurs. Beyond them lay a space vaster than any battlefield, broader than any cathedral of the Imperium. It was horizonless, yet filled with light, and that light was not steady but alive, shifting, throbbing, bending into shapes too immense to comprehend. At first it seemed to him an arena, a stage whose floor stretched into infinity. Rows upon rows of souls filled the expanse, yet no boundary could be seen. The ground beneath him was not stone, nor flesh, nor even sound, but the idea of being watched. He did not walk so much as he was displayed, carried forward by the eyes upon him. The crooked ember in his chest pulsed uneasily, its small flame threatened by the immensity of gaze. Here, the courtiers were gone. The masquerade had been stripped away. What remained was not intimacy, but grandeur. Voices rose, countless and layered, not in the fragmented chorus of the feast, nor in the carnivalesque mockery of the masks, but in something closer to liturgy. They chanted names, names too vast, too adorned with meaning to belong to mortals. Some he almost recognized from half-forgotten shrines, titles whispered of in the dark corners of the guard, curses carved into hab walls by hands trembling with forbidden awe. Others were alien, incomprehensible, a flood of syllables that pressed against his mind like waves battering a wall. And through those names he felt the presence again, not close, not whispering, but everywhere. It towered in the chant, echoed in the void, draped across the horizon like a mantle woven of starlight and blood. He realized then that the carnival had only been prelude, a chamber rehearsal before the great performance. This eternal stage was where the Dark Prince feasted most deeply. The roles imposed upon him in the masquerade had been personal, intimate, tailored to his crooked self. But here, individuality dissolved into myth. The stage demanded archetypes, not men. His body swelled and shifted again, but this time the masks did not whisper. Instead, the chant commanded. One moment he was a conqueror, vast and resplendent, trampling nameless foes beneath armored boots. The next he was prey, bound and hunted, his every cry swallowed by the roar of predators unseen. Then he was supplicant, kneeling beneath the sun that burned with voices instead of light.
The transformations were not chosen for him. They were forced by the gaze, by the weight of collective desire. He staggered under the enormity of it. To be mocked, to be toyed with, to be adorned, these he could endure, crooked ember in hand. But to be remade as myth, as symbol, as raw story, this was obliteration by grandeur. No crookedness could resist it. No ember could burn brightly enough to be noticed amid the light of eternity. And yet, even here, he found a sliver of defiance. For though the gaze was immense, it was also distracted. Every soul upon the eternal stage was being bent, displayed, consumed in myth. He saw them rise and fall around him, their forms swelling into legends and collapsing into ruin. They were adored, they were reviled, they were exalted, they were crushed. And all of it was spectacle. He understood then that even eternity could not fix its attention on all things at once. There were seams in the gaze, brief ones, small ones, but seams all the same. The ember guttered within him, crooked and irregular. He cupped it in memory, as though his very being were hands shielding a flame from storm. He remembered the barracks again, the sound of boots on stone, the smell of rust on his lasgun. He remembered a joke muttered under breath, the grin it earned, the reprimand narrowly avoided. Small things, human things, crooked things. And in the endless light of the eternal stage, those crooked things remained unseen, slipping through the cracks of myth, like sand through clenched fists. It was not victory. It was not escape. But it was survival of a kind.
The chant swelled, voices rising higher, and he felt the presence lean closer, not with intimacy, but with the full weight of its immensity. "You will play forever," it said, not as whisper but as decree, thundering across 1,000 tongues. "You will wear every story, you will sing every hunger, you will become every echo." And the stage roared its approval, vast and unending. The decree did not strike like a blow, it settled like climate, an atmosphere so complete that to breathe was to consent. I felt the stage tilt beneath me as if the gaze itself were a gravity, and I slid into another role before I could brace. Armor unfurled around my limbs with the hush of silk and the rasp of chain. It looked like triumph until I tried to move, and then I knew it for what it was, ceremony hardened into a cage. Somewhere the audience, no faces, only will, decided I was conqueror again. A banner budded from my fist, heavy as guilt, its cloth alive with scenes of victories I had never earned. Each embroidered figure was a mouth, and each mouth sang my name with vowels drawn out until it tasted like flattery. I wanted to drop the banner. The etiquette of the moment would not permit it. My knees locked into a practiced stride, and the floor became cities. Under every step something shattered like glass and cried like bone. The next breath turned, and the story turned with it. The armor fell away, not shed but reeled off me on invisible spools, and I was prey. Not beast prey with the charity of fangs and speed, but pageant prey, stripped of context, displayed, given the privilege of suffering beautifully. Ropes that were not ropes spiraled my wrists, humming like tuned strings. Invisible archers loosed rumors instead of arrows, and each rumor struck and blossomed into sensation, sweet as ripe fruit, rotten at the core. The chorus told me I had asked for this. The chorus was not wrong. Who among us had not, in some weak corner, wanted to be the center of the world's attention, even for a heartbeat? The eternal stage made of that corner a continent and crowned it. Between roles the gaps were thin as a sigh, and in those thin spaces I learned to count. Not time, the stage had no time, only movements, but the small beats between the large ones, rests inside the swell. One rest long enough to recall the weight of a standard issue canteen, another to remember the dirt that gathered in the crease of a thumb and would not wash out.
another to try to say my name and find the syllables clotting, stubborn but present. I cupped those beats like contraband flame. The stage noticed, of course. The stage notices everything, but not at once. It let some of the beats go, because the spectacle was rich, and I was only one of countless dishes. It would come back for them later. That was the terror and the advantage. The chant drew breath and changed key. The light thickened until it took taste, salt metal on the tongue. I became supplicant again, knees pressed into a floor that had no grain and yet rasped like sandstone. A sun rose that was made of voices, millions of throats braided into a single star. It spoke without words, and the meaning slid under my ribs like a fine blade. You are what they want. Not what you are, not what you were, what they want. I bowed, because there was no posture left to take. My forehead touched, not stone but the soft resistance of a heartbeat, as if the stage itself had veins. The heat stung my scalp and then cooled with the sudden generosity of mercy. I breathed it in, and mercy turned to perfume. It would have been easy then to believe in benevolence. I kept my hands open on the floor and counted the grit that was not there. When I rose, the scene had already shifted. I stood at the lip of a balcony that circled the horizon, and below me the stage revealed a geography I had not yet seen. Not palaces or gardens, but lattices of sensation stretched taut across gulfs, bridges spun from promises, elevators of praise rising and falling like pistons. On those spans moved hosts that were not the courtiers of the carnival, nor the indistinct audience beyond the glare, but something between, officiants perhaps, or archivists. They bore trays on which lay the arranged moments of uncounted souls, first betrayals under crystal domes, last kisses in thorns, 1,000 renunciations pinned like butterflies. Each embroidered figure was a mouth, and each mouth sang my name with vowels drawn out until it tasted like flattery. I wanted to drop the banner. The etiquette of the moment would not permit it. My knees locked into a practiced stride, and the floor became cities. Under every step something shattered like glass and cried like bone.
A tremor of anger rose in me, clean as thirst. It did not make me noble. It made me particular. I pressed the anger against the ember to see which would consume which, and neither did. They sat together awkwardly, as soldiers from different regiments sit when a transport is too full. The stage leaned, curious at the unresolved chord, and the officiants below tilted their trays a fraction as if to catch any spill. An impulse seized me then, reckless, useless, mine. I leaned over the railing and spoke down to the procession with a voice I had not been allowed in chapters, a voice that cracked where it should have soared. I said, "Leave one crooked." It was not a command, not even a plea, only a suggestion hurled at immensity. The trays did not waver. The officiants did not look up. The stage answered instead with a breath that lifted every hair I no longer had and left my skin that was not skin prickling. Suggestion had flavor here, and someone liked it. The decree returned, not as thunder now, but as the caress of inevitability. "You will be everything," the presence said. And the word everything was roomy enough to sound like kindness until you climbed inside it and discovered the hooks. Archetypes poured over me again. Saint crowned in thorns spun from audience gaze. Libertine drowning in perfume that remembered every name he had ever spoken. Traitor bearing standards he had never betrayed. Martyr whose blood rang on stone like a bell tuned to pleasure. I wore them in sequence, then overlapping, then all at once until I felt the old panic clawing up my throat. The ember flared against it, crooked as ever, and the panic learned to sit beside it like weather sits beside stone. I trembled. I did not break. The myth cycle accelerated. Now I was a world, and beneath my steps swam creatures of desire snared in my tides. Now I was a knife whose edge was consent, and every willing palm bled when it pressed close. Now I was a song sung by a choir of throats that had loved and hated me in equal measure. Each role came with its own vocabulary, its own posture, its own logic, and each tried to colonize the ember with its grammar. In some, I felt strong and hated it. In others, I felt small and loved it. The stage took notes. I could feel the quills scratch. It would recompose me later, polish my preferences into symmetries I would not recognize as mine. There were seams in the gaze, and there were seams in the chant, but the surest seam was in the shift itself. Between archetype and archetype, when the costume had not yet settled, and the pose had not yet convinced even itself, there was a sliver where nothing fit. That was where the crooked lived most easily. I learned to dangle in that sliver like a man hangs from a parapet by fingertips. The eternal stage disliked it. The stage admired it. The stage devoured it. All three were true. The balance was a miracle measured in splinters. Once, only once, I felt something like shadow fall across the light. Not absence, not relief, but coolness with edges. It came without scent, without sound, the way the idea of a door arrives in a dream. The chant faltered by a heartbeat's ghost. The officiants below stilled with their trays held level. The archetype I had been about to inherit, penitent with his throat bared to a jeweled blade, paused half-drawn. In the hush, a rumor moved among the souls, not as speech, but as posture. That sometimes, rarely, a glance in this place turned elsewhere. Not away, there is no away here, but elsewhere. Toward matters not of spectacle, but of balance. Toward vows older than hunger. The rumor did not wear doctrine. It wore hope the way a mendicant wears a coat, thin, patched, ludicrous, warm. I did not name what I thought of then. To name is to feed. I only stood very still and let the coolness pass through me like a remembered breeze in a trench at dawn. The light thickened again, the rumor thinned. The penitent's blade finished its descent and became a ribbon that stroked my throat instead of opening it. The audience roared, satisfied that the pause had been prelude after all. The stage resumed its measureless appetite. But I had felt that thin coolness, and its memory sat beside the ember, another shard I could not polish. I am not saved. I will not be. Here, salvation is just another costume. But on the eternal stage, where I am told I will be sung forever, I have begun to collect unmarketable things. The weight of a canteen, the habit of a buckled strap, the taste of grit, the rumor without a face, the splinter of a name too plain to echo well. The presence watches as I pocket them one by one in a uniform that no longer hangs on a body. I think it is amused. I think it is patient. It has all the patience that ever was. The chant lifts for another key, higher, brighter, ready to fit me for a crown that will bite just enough to please. I let it, because refusal here is just another song. But inside the fitting there is a seam, and in the seam there is a handhold, and under my ribs the crooked ember burns the way a memory burns when no one else remembers it for you.
The chant rose until it felt like a tide breaking against my ribs, and once more the stage bent me into a form of its choosing. I was martyr again, my skin luminous with wounds that were not mine, each cut orchestrated to gleam like stained glass beneath the light. The audience moaned in hunger, in joy, in worship, and I felt the pull to surrender fully, to let myself be eaten by this role until nothing crooked remained. But even as I bled, the ember smoldered within me, crooked and stubborn, and I remembered the weight of silence between orders, the smell of recalf gone bitter in a tin cup, the way comrades' laughter sometimes cracked the iron mask of fear. I held those crooked memories like contraband, knowing the stage would one day discover them,
polish them, and serve them as delicacies. But for now, they were mine. The chant faltered, only slightly, but enough that the archetype cracked. For an instant, I was not martyr, nor conqueror, nor supplicant. I was nameless again. I whispered my name in the gap, jagged and plain, and the stage recoiled as though struck by something unfit for performance. The light quivered, the officiants paused, the presence leaned closer, not furious, but fascinated. "You still insist on a shape that does not shine?" it said, its voice vast enough to shake the horizon. "Very well, then let that crooked ember burn. You will keep it, and I will keep you, and eternity will savor both." The chant surged back, louder than before, drowning him in archetypes once more. Yet beneath it, faint but unbroken, the ember beat against his ribs, a flame that refused to extinguish, even as the eternal stage roared on without end. The hall darkened, and from beyond the horizon, something greater than the carnival, greater than the stage, seemed to stir. Rumor wearing the skin of liturgy, speculation clothed in prayer. What came next was not spectacle, but mystery. The eternal stage gave way to whispers of the veiled court. The darkness did not arrive like night. It was woven into the light itself, threads of shadow unraveling from the brilliance until they coiled in the air, soft and deliberate. The chant of the eternal stage thinned into murmurs, layered whispers that no longer pressed him into archetype, but seemed instead to confer, as though an unseen audience debated his worth. The masks clinging to him loosened further, their painted eyes dimming, their jeweled mouths falling silent. For the first time since death had delivered him to this place, he was not compelled to move. He stood in stillness, and stillness was terrifying. Without the roar, without the rhythm, the silence felt heavier than chains. He could hear the crooked ember in his chest too clearly, its irregular beat echoing like a flaw in perfect machinery. Each pulse seemed louder than the last, until he feared it would draw the gaze of something even more immense than what had already claimed him. Then the mist parted, and the court revealed itself. They were not courtiers of the carnival, nor officiants of the stage. These were veiled figures, seated upon thrones that did not rest on ground, but floated in the vastness like thoughts too heavy to fall. Their garments were draped not in jewels or silk, but in symbols, fractals of shifting runes, shifting with every glance. Their faces were concealed, yet he felt the weight of their eyes, cool and piercing, unclouded by spectacle. Where the carnival had been indulgence, where the stage had been appetite, the veiled court was judgment. One leaned forward, its veil trembling with a voice that was not voice, but vibration, felt in bone rather than heard in ear.
Another responded, tones sharp as a blade scraped across stone. "He carries crooked fire." A third laughed softly, though the sound was brittle, like glass cracking. "Crooked fire is still fire. The prince delights in imperfection made exquisite." Their words coiled around him, binding tighter than chains ever had. He wanted to speak, to demand what this court was, why they presided above even the stage. But he remembered what speech cost here. Every syllable could be stolen, gilded, turned into echo. So he held his tongue, guarding silence as his last crooked possession. The court took note. He felt their attention sharpened like scalpels poised above flesh.
One veil rippled, and a question slithered into him. "Do you think yourself beyond us?" The ember pulsed once, hot and painful. He did not answer. The silence stretched, and then, impossibly, one of the veiled figures inclined its head, not in deference, not in mercy, but in acknowledgment, as though his refusal was itself a kind of testimony. The mist thickened around him, swallowing the thrones, dimming the judgmental stares until only whispers remained. But those whispers were different from the feast, the masks, or the stage. These were not indulgent or mocking. They were contemplative, uncertain, almost reverent. And in their uncertainty, he realized the final truth of his damnation. To be claimed by Slaanesh was not to be erased. It was to be displayed, catalogued, debated, adorned, judged, and remembered forever. The crooked ember beat on, unseen but never extinguished. The mist folded and unfolded like breathing, and with each slow inhalation the thrones drew nearer without crossing any distance. The veiled court regarded me as an artisan regards a flawed piece, not to discard it, but to decide which flaw to frame. The runes that hung from their garments shifted in quiet spirals, forming sigils that pressed at the edges of thought without quite entering. I had seen banners blessed by Ministorum priests, data slates signed with cog ritual ciphers, purity seals kissed and fixed across flak plates. Those marks bore purpose a man could name. These runes felt older than purpose and lighter than law, the decoration of verdicts already known. A tremor of sound rippled from the farthest throne, as if someone had drawn a bow across the gut strings of the void. "We convene," said a voice beneath a veil of dusk, "to weigh the worth of a persistence." The word persistence landed with the weight of accusation and the patience of praise. It endures. It refuses to be fully rendered. It remains particular in a place designed for perfection. The veils of the other figures stirred, acknowledging the charge, or the compliment, or both. Everything here was both.
I did not kneel. It was not bravery. It was a habit from mornings without ceremony, the old cadence of standing to attention when called, and the court tasted that old cadence the way a sommelier tastes a wine. A veil turned toward me as a physician turns toward an unexpected symptom. "Stand then," came a whisper of silk over steel. "Stand as you did when your boots were wet and your nerves were an orchestra too tightly strung. Stand and let us see if your crookedness is craft or mere noise." The masks that had haunted me through the carnival shifted on my skin like resting birds roused to wakefulness. None of them seized the moment. The eternal stage had taught them hierarchy. Here they were attendants rather than masters. The crooked ember beat once, twice. Irregular. I could feel the court's attention located the way a predator locates heat. A veil leaned, and the air cooled until it tasted of stone kept in shadow. "Name," said the cool voice, and I felt the syllable unhooking locks within me. Names are a currency in the Imperium, traded at musters and etched into shrine walls by fingers that shake. I had refused to spend mine on the stage, and the stage had been annoyed, but satisfied with spectacle. The court did not barter in spectacle. It bartered in essence. I understood with a fear so clean it tasted like water that if I gave my name here, it would enter a ledger no fire would ever burn. Not obliteration, not mercy, not even the gilded devouring of the feast. Record. "Name," repeated the voice, and the chamber's fabric flexed as if to make room for the entry. In the Astra Militarum, there is courage for charges and courage for hunger and courage for boredom that can kill a man more thoroughly than shrapnel. I mustered the smallest kind and shaped air without sound. I mouthed my name rather than spoke it. The veils registered the motion. The runes dimmed, then brightened, then rearranged themselves into a geometry that said, "Sufficient." My name, unvoiced, lodged between us like a pebble under a tongue, undeniable, inelegant, never to be chewed into music. The court's acceptance was not approval, it was jurisdiction. "Consider," said another voice, warmer than the rest, velvet thrown over an anvil. "The prince is appetite given system. We are the system. A crooked ember that cannot be smoothed may yet be set, here, here, and here, into a lattice where its refusal refracts delight. It resists, we admire resistance. We break nothing, we wend." The veil rippled as if nodding to its own argument. The chamber answered with a murmur like a congregation savoring an unexpected doctrine. Across from it, a veil pricked the air with needles of consonants. "There is precedent," it observed, and the word precedent curdled my stomach with the cleanliness of its ruthlessness. Souls neither annihilated nor exalted, but curated. Certain echoes kept raw to deepen the chord, certain names not sung but indexed. The prince's pleasure is widest when the palate is broadest. Keep the ember crooked, cage the context. It would have been easy to hate them if they had gloated. They did not. Their attention was precise, their rhetoric calm. They were not torment, they were administration. Something in me recoiled more fiercely from the administration than from the ecstasies of the carnival. The courtiers had smelted shame into gold, the stage had stretched hunger into myth, the veiled court merely arranged. I tasted the brass of parade ground dust on my tongue and thought absurdly of inspection lines, buttons checked, boots polished, lashings tight. How tidy damnation could be when given clerks. "Objection," said a veil whose runes burned white, and the chamber cooled another degree. "We confuse endurance with integrity. This one persists not from piety," the word carried no ministorum holiness here, only a technical category, "but from habit. Memory is not virtue, particularity is not sanctity. There is no merit we are bound to crown."
The protest eased something in me, even as its knife edge pressed into my ribs. I had not wanted a crown. I wanted only not to be erased. "Merit," echoed the warmer veil, amused. "We are not the lex imperialis. We are appetite's auditors." The phrase hung in the air like a standard no one dared lower. "Our task is not to bless, but to balance. Does the crooked note make the symphony sweeter? Yes, then we keep it. Does the name, unvoiced, thicken the perfume? Yes, then we bottle it." The court agreed by degrees, not with applause, but with a settling, like sand finding the bottom of a glass. A pause followed, deep enough to hear my ember stumble and right itself. In that gap, a rumor arrived. Not spoken by the court, not projected by the stage, not scented by the carnival. It moved like a draft through a sealed room, and the veils did not shiver. A thought with no author brushed my cheek, that beyond appetite, beyond arrangement, there existed a light that was not a song, a gaze that was not a crowd. I did not assign it a name. To say Astronomicon aloud would have been to embroider it. To think golden throne as certainty would have been to lie. The rumor wore prayer the way mist wears moonlight. I did what a man does in a trench when he hears a story of relief columns that may not exist. I pocketed it, neither discarding nor saluting it, and waited to see if dawn had a shape. The court resumed. "Disposition," said the first veil, and the word chimed finality. A runic mesh unrolled between the thrones like a net made of decisions. "We place the soul on the eternal stage when spectacle fattens delight. We pass it to the carnival when heat is needed. We return it to the feast when flavor thins. Between these we archive. Between archives we audit." The mesh tightened,
and I felt its pattern settle over me. No sting, no press, only the knowledge of a grid. I had been inventoried. "Reservation," added the needled voice, precise as a scribe's flourish at the end of a line. "Leave the name unvoiced. Protect the crooked ember from polishing. Do not dull the stubborn. Do not sharpen it either. A raw edge cuts longer." The assent was not a cheer. It was a ledger entry scribed, a sigil stamped, a seal pressed home. The mist folded once more. The thrones receded as if on rails no eye could see. Their veils did not flutter triumph or pity. Judgment here had the mercy of exactness. The chamber's light thinned to the powder glow that precedes pageants. Far beyond, I heard again the stage preparing its hymn, the carnival flexing its silks, the feast setting out its silver. I recognized the machinery of eternity and the smallness of my place in it. The ember answered with its crooked beat, and the court, having measured it, allowed the beat to remain off time. I was not spared. I was not lost. I was kept. The mist steadied. A corridor opened, not to exit. There is no exit. To processional. It smelled faintly of incense and oil, a scent I could nearly pretend belonged to a shrine somewhere a long march from the front. I let the lie stand at arm's length and did not hug it. The corridor's floor thrummed with the old, tireless music. The stage waited. The court had chosen. The prince would be pleased. I took one step, and in the small hinge of that motion, boot, buckle, breath, I hid a memory too homely to record. The sound of a comrade's quiet snore, and the way it had once made me smile in the dark because it meant I was not alone.
The corridor narrowed the farther I walked, though its walls were nothing but shifting haze, runes and faint echoes embedded like veins of ore. I knew the eternal stage waited ahead, its hunger constant as breath. But the residue of the court clung to me like chalk dust. Their verdict was not chains, it was inventory. I had been weighed, categorized, shelved. Yet the crooked ember still beat against the shelf walls, scuffing the polish, leaving its mark in a place that abhorred blemish. The procession of sound thickened, drums without source rolling beneath my soles, and in the distance the roar swelled. The stage had dressed itself anew. I felt the masks stir, eager to wear me again, but their grip was lighter, as if reluctant to intrude upon the ledger mark the court had made. That reluctance was its own torment. To be fought is at least to feel alive. To be filed is to risk dissolving into footnote. I clenched a memory, the bitter warmth of a ration swallowed on a dare, comrades laughing at its foulness, and pressed it into the ember. The crooked flame flared, and I knew it had been seen. The court was not gone. Its veiled watchers were not bound to place. I sensed them as silhouettes in peripheral vision, occupying the folds between the stage's curtains, hovering at the edges of the carnival's mirrors. They would return to measure me again, to note how the crookedness bent or held, to debate whether my persistence sharpened delight or soured it. This was eternity now, spectacle to bind, auditors to classify, rumor to wound or soothe. Damnation had tears, and each was a mouth drinking slowly. The stage yawned open, vast as before, and light washed over me like surf. The chant rose, and I felt myself pulled back into its currents, shaped for roles I had not chosen, yet aware now of the ledger's ink on my skin. I had been claimed twice. Once by the appetite that made of me a dish, and once by the court that made of me an entry. Somewhere a veil whispered across the void, "The crooked endures." And the ember answered, beating once more against the dark. The roar of the stage embraced me once more, but its grip no longer felt absolute. The archetypes gathered like hungry hounds, each vying to wear me.
Martyr with a throat of glass, tyrant with a banner of silk, supplicant drowning in perfume that burned the lungs. They circled, eager but hesitant, as if aware of the verdict that had already been passed in the veiled court. Their claws did not dig so deep. Their songs did not pierce so far. The masks slipped against my skin, testing the fit, then withdrawing, leaving my face bare for seconds longer than eternity allowed. The audience beyond the glare howled for resolution. They had seen too many crescendos, too many climaxes. They hungered for something new, even if they could not name it. I understood then that my crooked ember, flawed and irregular, was novelty enough. I was not free, never free, but I had become texture, a dissonance they could not smooth away, and so they fed on it with greed disguised as awe. My crookedness was no rebellion, it was a seasoning. And yet knowing that, I clung to it, because even a seasoning remembers it was once whole. The stage shifted again, but now the mist at its edges glimmered faintly, as if thrones still hovered unseen. The veiled court had not dismissed me. They lingered in the wings, auditors watching their entry in the great archive, measuring how well the crooked ember burned when exposed to fresh light. I knew they would return, and return again, endlessly. Judgment here was not a final blow, but a rhythm, as constant as a drumbeat, as patient as wrought.
And in that knowledge came a cruel clarity. Damnation was not a descent into one moment of pain or ecstasy stretched forever. It was a cycle, endlessly repeating, endlessly adjusted, each loop tightening its grip. The carnival would mock, the feast would gorge, the stage would exalt, the court would record, and I would persist, crooked and unpolished, a flaw too useful to erase. That was my eternity, not annihilation, not redemption, a ledgered survival, burned into spectacle, whispered about in rumor, filed beneath veils, yet always incomplete. The ember pulsed again, faint but steady, and for the first time I did not imagine it as resistance. I imagined it as witness, crooked, flawed, unwanted, and still bearing memory. The chant rose, the lights burned, and eternity moved forward, one step closer to devouring me, one step closer to preserving me. Both at once, always both. The veiled court's final words lingered, though they had not spoken them aloud. You are not saved, you are not lost, you are kept. And in that keeping, my crooked ember endured.